partnership with Jembe Communications.
Africa is opening up. With some of the fastest growing economies and markets in the world, the continent is steadfastly marching towards becoming the next frontier for global investment. Governments across the continent are introducing reforms to improve the ease of doing business, proactively seeking new foreign direct investment, and improving the terms for foreign investors.
Well, since the collapse of the oil price in about 2014, we've seen an improvement in Africa's performance, but also the foreign direct inflows in terms of FDI, foreign direct investment, is beginning to increase. Of course, it varies across countries. The natural resource sector, the oil sector specifically, continues to be the biggest draw card in terms of attracting foreign direct investment. So really, resources are still driving FDI. But also on the portfolio front, you begin to see strong inflows and improving inflows in liquid markets such as in Ivory Coast, in South Africa, in Kenya, Egypt, and so forth.
Cutting across virtually all the sectors, manufacturing, lots of multinationals have actually come into Africa given the size of the population and the dynamism within Africa, as it were. In addition, the energy is a sector which is crucial for the renaissance of Nigeria, so there's been lots of investment also in oil and gas. Financial services is another area which indeed has gotten quite a fair share of investments. There's a lot of activity around fintechs, in Africa as we speak. The telecom sector has also been one that has grown rapidly over the last decade and has gotten its fair share of investments as well. And so the story of Africa is one of investments that cut across virtually most of the sectors, and it's reflective of the reality of the emergence of Africa as a new frontier for growth for people designing investors globally.
Africa's got good fundamentals, so we know that a lot of countries now are looking at industrialization. So we know that a lot of countries are trying to attract investment from what do they need to grow industrialization. And they know that their populations are growing. So they're starting to open up a lot more and allowing businesses to flourish in the countries. So we see a lot of business friendliness, at least increased level of business friendliness. We see a lot of speed in certain industries that government has prioritized. So because of that, that attracts a number of FDIs coming into and flocking into those countries.
Every year, the continent's top CEOs and business executives gather at the Africa CEO Forum to showcase Africa's economic transformation and the essential role of the continent's private sector. The number of businesses represented at the forum are testament to the fact that while the continent still has its challenges, Africa's business leaders agree that these challenges create a wealth of opportunity within themselves.
The priority sector for Africa, in my view, is the infrastructure sector. The energy sector, transport sector. We still have serious power outages in economies. Some of the largest economies in Africa are experiencing power outages. So more investment is required in the power sector. But also in the transport sector, I would say in the area of ports. For example, we are building a port, deep sea port in Cabinda. In Angola, for example, we're looking at other ports across Africa because 75% of Africa's trade goes through the port system. So it's very important to have a working port, connecting roads, connecting rail to this port.
The need for Africa today is actually to build industry. The need for Africa today is to actually, create a continent where there's real jobs are being created on ground. It's a continent where you want to see brick and mortar investments in manufacturing, in industry, in healthcare, in education. So lots of priority areas are going to be crucial for Africa. Africa has the largest concentration of youths, and by 2050, one in every living person on the continent will be an African. And that, it's a reflection of the size and the growth potentials that you actually see in Africa. You have to feed the additional 1.3 billion people that are expected in the continent by 2050. And you have to transport them. You have to clothe them. So when you reflect on Africa, it's oozing with all sorts of opportunities. So it's a question of, the risk appetite of the investor. It's about reflecting and saying, where do I actually start, or which areas do I want to focus on? Like one of my mentors will say that Africa is an open canvas and you can paint whatever you want to on it.
What's very important today is to look beyond the commodities. What's important is for the countries to start transforming their commodities in Africa, to start industrializing the economies, which will bring not only improvements in balance of payments, but would also bring jobs and taxes into the country. And the steps that are taken with the free trade zone are hopefully a good step in that direction.
African governments have proven their commitment to improving the ease of doing business on the continent by championing widespread reforms, decreasing red tape, and identifying priority sectors for investment.
If I were to be an African minister, I might be thinking about how do I create job growth and looking at sectors where jobs will be created. So services is one, tourism would be another. Agribusiness employs 60% of the people in Africa, so I would be focusing on agribusiness. But again, you need power to create economic growth.
In the past, the state has played a very big role in many of the countries here, and that's a step that needs to go in the evolution of the governance of a country to realize the importance of the public sector, to realize the importance to incentivize the public sector to grow and develop. And quite frankly, many of the countries in Africa are quite small in terms of population, so allowing these regional convergence and the free trade across the continent will increase the size of the market that can be addressed by these companies, and this also will make return on investments much more attractive.
Obviously, we know that we have to open up the borders to trade a lot more, especially regionally. So you'll see infrastructure becomes one of the key industries that you'll have to look into. Then from infrastructure, we then have to look into what is this growing population going to eat. So we have to be looking in some of those industries to try and stimulate the growth, and also try and make sure that South Africa itself is sustainable and can feed itself. So for us, the industries that we see are a lot more diverse. It's around supporting mega trends of industrialization, mega trends around a growing urban population, growing infrastructural requirements. So if you follow certain trends like those, it will then give you a wider perspective on how you can actually tap into the opportunities that Africa has.
And one of the opportunities that Africa gambled on and won has been mobile communications and technology. The digital revolution has accelerated the modernization of several sectors, including finance, agriculture, and health. It's proved a game changer for Africa, something that global telecommunications giant Orange took notice of over 2 decades ago, when they entered the African market. Their African footprint has allowed them to grow revenues year on year, with a client base of over 11 million for 4G alone.
Please take in count the incredible potentiality of digital transformation of traditional economy. Digital is not only startup, it is startup. And it's very important to develop the ecosystem for the startup, because if we have not startup, we have not development of new services. But it's also the transformation of traditional economy, and we have to invest. When you speak about education, Orange has a partnership with the CNED, who permit to deliver in francophone language all the formation from primary school to university. To have coder, to have data scientists, all this new material we are able to deliver and to invest in the training for the young of Africa. So my message is also to say yes, mobile is key to accelerate development of Africa, to be able to rebalance the gap that there is in terms of physical infrastructure. It's true for education, it's true for health, it's true for agriculture, and so on. So our responsibility of private sector is to reinvest and to develop investment to take this opportunity.
There's great opportunity for startups, especially in the tech space, to attract foreign direct investment into Africa. Why? Because it's amazing how innovative Africans are, whether they're looking at West Africa, whether they're looking at East Africa, when we're looking at it everywhere, Africans are innovating, they're the cutting edge of innovation. And unfortunately, domestically, you don't have a lot of venture capitalists. In fact, there are very few venture capitalists and also angel investors. So this is where we expect foreign investors to come from and invest in tech startups in Africa. The issue has been the speed with which they are able to patent their ideas, to test their ideas. Governments need to help, but clearly the private sector should see this as an opportunity.
So to create a digital economy, you need to have the right connectivity to ensure that you can communicate both within your own country, across the continent, and internationally or globally. I think the second thing really has to do with human capital development and ensuring that you have a group of consumers who are technically fluent and capable of using technology skills to be able to use your products. And third, I think you do need to build entrepreneurship, and that entrepreneurship is both technical entrepreneurship, so the next unicorn in Africa, so who builds the next Facebook, but also social entrepreneurship. So how do you actually create an environment that's conducive to small SMEs to grow and prosper, again, because they create jobs.
We're watching the digital space a lot more. I think it's growing faster than we're imagining. And by it, what's beautiful is that we're seeing a lot more innovations come on the ground. So we're certainly watching that space for us. It also has a potential of reducing the cost of doing business in certain countries for us. But at the same time, we do see that the industrialization agenda needs to be driven quite hard. But on the back of that, there is a strong requirement to have strong technical skills that will be able to sustain these developments that we see.
At the heart of Africa's digital economy lies probably one of its biggest assets, its demographic. With over 40% of working-age population between the ages of 15 and 24, Africa is, technically speaking, the youngest continent in the world. And educating the continent is something that Honoris United University CEO Luis Lopez believes opens up doors for further future investment.
When you have demographics the way you do in Africa, and you have government focus, NGO focus, private enterprise focus on how to be effective, education is the only answer. And so when you think about education as an enabler, we as a group, we're private equity backed, and therefore we have resources in order to think about the continent in its size. But we also have the ability to think about education in many forms. The wave of students that are coming have a way of thinking and processing and making decisions using information and using platforms that are very unfamiliar to us in our own education. And so when you think about the way the student is going to be capable of experiencing the future world, technology is absolutely a big component of that. So we have to bring technology into education. And in some ways, that can be seen as a challenge, but I just love the idea of technology as a disruptor in education. It's a way of creating access, it's a way of creating replicability, it's a way of measuring quality. And so technology and education is something that I'm very supportive of, and we're promoting it within our own units.
Demographics is a massive opportunity for Africa. There will be a large part of the world's working age population will be in Africa in the next 20, 30 years. But the big question is, will the governments put in place proper education and training to make these people that are growing up employable with the right skills to invest in the industries that will be the predominant ones in those next 20, 30 years. And that's a big if. That's very much what the government should be focusing on now, is a demographic issue. It can either be a fantastic opportunity or it can be a massive burden.
In partnership with Djembe Communications. In partnership with Djembe Communications.
In order to fully realize Africa's investment potential, the private sector is proving to be vital. Representing 2/3 of the total investment on the continent, 3/4 of the generation of wealth, and 90% of the employment opportunities, the private sector is unquestionably the engine driving economic development.
I think the private sector is the only way this is going to really work out. Government's role usually is about creating an enabling environment. If we're going to get it right as far as Africa is concerned, it's going to have to be a partnership between government and the private sector. Government should create an enabling environment, ensure security, ensure the regulatory environment is certain, and then get out of the way for the private sector to unleash its potentials. You see, African entrepreneurs, the private sector in Africa, they're actually quite enterprising, they're very energetic, and all they're looking for is an enabling environment, and they will unleash all the potentials they've got.
I think that the governments need to realize that their role is to encourage and to incentivize the investments from the private sector. So certainly the words that are coming out of Zimbabwe these days are very encouraging. I had a breakfast with a group of investors and the Minister of Finance of Zimbabwe earlier this morning, and the minister said, if we're in the process of removing all barriers to investment, and if you come across any barriers, please let me know and we'll remove those as well. So this kind of language is new and refreshing, and will attract investments.
And according to Quantum Global Research Lab, many other African countries are following suit. At the 2018 CEO Forum, they launched the Africa Investment Index 2018, a comprehensive guide to the investment attractiveness of African countries in the medium term, a vital resource for foreign investors.
In our Africa Investment Index, the top country is Morocco for a variety of reasons. It's about the size of the economy, the demographics, it's about the proximity to Europe, it's about the ease of doing business in the country. It's also about the risk indicators, which are quite favorable. The number 2 position goes to Egypt. Again, it's a large population, almost close to 100 million people, slowly coming out. It's a large economy too, The growth is picking up. You still have some, risk issues to go through, with exchange rate risk and so forth, if you're a short-term investor. But again, all the variables are pointing in the right direction. Number 3 is Algeria, which has got, in terms of risk, has got the lowest risk indicators because of the large foreign reserves. It's a large economy and so forth. Number 4 is Botswana. Botswana is actually a small economy, but it's got very strong risk indicators in terms of ease of doing business. So it ranks quite highly. If you're coming to West Africa, saying that we're here in Cote d'Ivoire, the highest ranked country is Cote d'Ivoire. Growth, is quite strong, close to 8%. It was above 8% last year. And agriculture, obviously, is the mainstay here. It's quite a diversified economy, and the government is doing all the right things in encouraging investment, opening up the economy. That's why it's highly ranked.
Increasingly, what you find is that with Africa and capital is looking for environments where there's certainty. Capital is looking for places where the regulatory environment is clear. It's looking for where not only is the returns, meeting their requirements, but that clarity in terms of the regulatory and the enabling environment is usually very critical. So countries like Ghana is attracting its fair share of investment. Countries like Cote d'Ivoire, given the kind of macroeconomic stability it's actually enjoyed in the recent past, is attracting its fair share of investment. Countries like like Rwanda, has been a phenomenal story of success. So smaller countries are also attracting their fair share. Once you actually do the housekeeping that is required to ensure you are open for business, then certainly investment capital will flow in. But the big countries, obviously because of the size of their markets, will also attract their fair share. So when you look at Africa, so it's a question, there's no one size fits all. It's a question of choosing, that which is responsive to the needs of the, owners of capital. And I think everyone actually has an opportunity to actually attract foreign direct investments.
And one way of deepening this economic prosperity is already well on its way to being realized. Historically, intra-African connectivity has been a barrier to investment on the continent. But earlier this year, 44 African leaders signed an agreement to create the African Continental Free Trade Area, potentially one of the world's largest trading blocs, and a move that is sure to widen the continent's investment horizons.
One of the challenges in Africa historically has been the issue of most of the trade in Africa has been with the rest of the world. And there's been very limited, intra-Africa trade between countries. such an agreement is going to be fundamental to actually stimulate intra-Africa trade. It's going to actually ensure that, Africa, there's domestic demand in Africa is actually being stimulated such that you can actually produce in Africa for Africans, and trade from one particular areas of production can be made available for areas where, where there's a need. So I think by and large, it's really about Africa. I mean, the story of Africa has to be one of inclusive growth, and I think this Pan-African Trade Agreement is going to be one of those critical things that actually will stimulate activity, stimulate domestic demand in Africa, and will make a difference for, Africa as a whole.
Well, it starts with employment. And so if the free trade agreement creates employment, and it will, you're opening up a very big market. Therefore, the students now have to have a skill set for a much more service. The nature of a free trade agreement has service included in it. So you talked about natural resources, extraction. That doesn't go away. But the free trade agreement is now transferability of goods and services, financials, insurance, healthcare. And therefore, what it promotes is a skill set that the students now need to prepare for.
It's a massive step for Africa. It's something that we've all been yearning for deep internally. Because I'll give you an example of if we're trying to help out a country to build a fertilizer plant, the economics of scale do not make sense for a particular country of a specific population size. But the minute it's easier to move that product across the region in multiple countries, suddenly it makes the project viable. And that's how we can unlock a lot more of these projects. We see a lot of those in, for instance, we also manufacture some components for some of the equipment that we sell. To move those equipment from one country to the other, it's a big issue. There's a lot of bureaucracy, there's a lot of inhibitors to getting that product through. So some of these developments are quite encouraging to us. One, it'll push that Africa starts talking to each other and certainly stimulate the growth that we know it's got.
Type of services. It's very difficult for SME in a country of Africa to know the rules which are practiced in the other part of Africa. So the global market is a strong and very good news to develop these new digital services. And what I hope it is that we go very quickly in that.
It will make it more attractive for investors such as ourselves in the PE space to argue for regional markets. So when I'm going to a country like Ghana, for example, it's not just about Ghana, it's about all the countries that are linked to Ghana. If I'm investing in Kenya, it's not just about Kenya, it's about Kenya, Tanzania. The whole regional integration agenda becomes more of about a bigger market rather than a single country market. So it's very positive for foreign direct investors and for the private sector.
If the sentiment at the CEO Forum is anything to go by, the investment outlook on the continent is overwhelmingly positive. With foreign direct investment growing, borders and red tape being torn down, and a wealth of human capital and knowledge, Africa is officially open for business.
When you have a growing population, a lot of the consumer product industries, telecommunications, fast-moving consumer goods, banking become very important and very attractive. And so the regulations need to be put in place to encourage people to come in. What's very important is to realize there are 54 countries in Africa. There's competition between them for investors, and there's competition with Latin America and Asia, Europe, United States, and so the framework really needs to be put in place to attract the investors.
I look at Africa in 2030 and I say to myself, every month between now and then, 1.7 million youth enter the job market. So we need to ensure that we create economic growth that creates jobs so that Africa can grow. The flip side of that is that by 2030, 100 million Africans will be middle class. And to me, that creates opportunity for all sorts of service sectors, tourism, education, health, and huge opportunity for growth.
2018 and beyond. Well, for me, I belong to the school of thought of the optimist. I know when people look around, sometimes there's a lot of concerns around poverty and the challenges on the continent, but I dare say that Africa has actually moved forward. I think things are better than they were a decade ago. I think the potentials of the future are still significant. And I think 2018 is just going to be another one of those years where Africa actually ticks the box as far as dealing with some of the fundamental issues that's confronting the continent. I mean, I think the future for Africa is very, very positive. I think there are housekeeping issues that needs to be dealt with. I think we need to continue to deal with the issues of governance. I think we need to be very focused in terms of ensuring that we are generating enough jobs for the teeming population. I think education and healthcare needs to continue to be front burner as far as the continent is concerned. But all these things, rather than see them as challenges, are opportunities. And what they do is give me optimism that the future indeed is going to be actually wonderful as far as Africa is concerned.
In partnership with